Hello and welcome back. So we're going to look at strings next. So inside of the chapter 1 test, let me reload this, scroll down and click on how strings work in the methods available so that way we're only loading up this piece of the suite. Go to your text editor, click on strings.js, and I'm going to add a debugger statement right here just so we can step through the code and see how it's all working. So the first test we're going to run is that it can uppercase a string. So we're going to get a test string. Then we're going to call the .to uppercase method on it. And this is why JavaScript doesn't have any true primitives, is because on this string that we just created there with the string literal syntax, we can call .to uppercase on it. And you can see there that our string has now become all uppercase. Next, there is, of course, an equivalent function called to lowercase, which will do the exact same thing to anything you pass in. Next is that strings inside of JavaScript are actually arrays of characters. So that means if I do var string equals some string, and I ask it to get me whatever is at position 3, which JavaScript is a zero index based language. So it actually starts counting at 0. So 0, 1, 2, 3, and that's going to get me the E right there. But we can test that out right here as well. We expect that on our test string, the first character is going to be A, and that is indeed true. Next, we're going to use index of, and what this allows you to do is it allows you to find the position of the starting position of a sequence of characters. So in this case, we have a test string called hey there, and then we're going to try to find out where there is. What position does that start off at? And we expect that the position is going to be 4. So again, counting from 0, 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4 is marks where the T is, and that's where there is found at, so that's the next value we get. Now, if you attempt to access a value that does not exist with index of, it returns -1. And this is one of those other weird things that occurs inside of JavaScript and other languages that use index of, because 0 is a valid position. Remember, 0 would be the H or the A up here. It needs to return a value that means not found. So they picked -1 for that. False seems like it would have been a better choice, but -1 it is. So there we say if we get a non-existent position, so unknown is not part of this string, we expect to get -1 back. And that's exactly what's going to occur. Next, we might want to get a substring of characters, and this is where index of comes in useful. So first we're going to say, all right, find out where index of T is, which is going to be right there, position 4, and they gave me the substring, which is going to get me everything from there on out until the end of the string. So I expect after that runs, the next piece I'm going to get is there. We can see that's true, and that works out. Next, we have length property, and this is available on arrays as well. So when we run this piece, we're going to get a test string of 1, 2, 3. Note this is a string of numbers. It is not actually a set of numbers that you can actually add up. You'll get some weird results if you attempt to do this. So there I'm going to get the length property on it, and there's going to be 4 because 1, 2, 3, 4 things are on here. Even though annoyingly it starts counting at 0 for an index, the length of everything is going to be starting at 1 based. There is a very common programmer error called off by 1, and this is often the reason why, is because some things start at 0, some things start at 1, and you just have to know which is which. Next, we're going to look at string concatenation, and most of programming is learning fancy names for very simple concepts. So concatenation just means to take one string and then add it onto some other string. And you can see right there, that's the value. So here we get hello with a space, and then we get world, and then whenever we add these two together, you get new string. We're going to expect that the new string is going to be equal to hello world. And it is, so that test is going to pass. Next here was the warning about the difference between a string of numbers and actual numbers. So here we have string 1, which is equal to the string 1. Then we have the number 1, which is also equal to 1. And we're going to add the string 1 equal to the number 1. And the unexpected result of that is 11. What you would probably expect to see is that 1 plus 1 equals 2. But that is not the case whenever one of these is a string. That's the reason why you're going to see this. This is what's known as typecasting. This makes sure that the number is actually a number before it attempts to use it. Next, we're going to look at coercing values, and there are a couple of ways to coerce values. One of which is, instead of using the constructor function of newString, just to use it as a static function, just call it a string, and that's going to do typecasting. One other thing you're going to see is where people will use plus and they'll put an empty string. And that's just a really short way to make sure that string 1 is equal to, or 1 or whatever you pass in there is actually equal to a string 1. So you can either use the string syntax or you can use a number and then adding in a blank string, which will also coerce it. Finally, one of the other things you're going to see a lot of times is you're going to see converting from strings to arrays. So I have a sequence 1, 2, 3, and 4 as a string, and I want to make sure that I can get 4 individual objects out of there. So by using string.split, that's going to look for the separator here, which is the empty space, and then it's going to create me a new array. And so if I want whatever's at value 1 or 0, that'll get me 1, 2, so forth. And I should get an error if I try to access something that is out of scope, and this is undefined here. In most other languages, this would throw an error, but in JavaScript, whenever you try to access something that doesn't exist, it just returns undefined. Unless you try to access something off of undefined that doesn't exist. So here I got r of 0.length, which doesn't exist, but if I tried that, now I get an error because undefined does not have a length property, whereas the strings that are stored inside of here do have length properties. Next, something very common you're going to see is removing white space. This happens a lot if you have people input in passwords or usernames. A lot of times they will inadvertently put a space in there, and in order to avoid locking them out of their account or otherwise confusing them, you can use the trim function, and that's going to remove any leading and trailing white space. So white space over here is called leading, and white space over here is called trailing. So you're going to see here that whenever we run that, and we call the trim method, this string right here had its white space stripped out right here. Next, sometimes you're going to need to replace a string. So in this case, we have the new string called cat. We're going to call .replace on it, and then we're going to say we're going to take the value cat, we're going to replace it with dog, and now you can see our new string is equal to dog. And when we run our test, we expect that new string is going to equal to dog, and it does. Next, you have to deal with what are called multi-line strings sometimes. Now, JavaScript is a white space insensitive language. That means that it really doesn't care where we put things for the most part. Like everything in JavaScript, there's going to be an exception to this when it comes to dealing with return and automatic semicolon insertion. But for right now, just know that it doesn't actually care how many spaces I put before or after, as long as I have at least one significant white space. Anything more or less doesn't matter. But you're going to find that people tend to use syntax pretty close to the one that I'm using. There are more or less rules, like some people will put one space before the function and one space after the function, or other such things like that. So here, what I need to do is I need to take a string that's on one line, and then I need to add it to the other. The most common way to do that is to use the plus operator as the last thing on that line. And that is far and away the recommended version. Now, the other way to do this is to use the backslash key. The backslash key stands for the escape sequence, and that means it's going to ignore whatever comes after that. And this has special reserved meanings inside of programming languages. But if I, as the very last thing, I put a backslash, and it has to be the very last thing, by the way, it's going to say, okay, ignore the space there. But then it's going to pick up all this other space. And you'll see that in this version right here, it doesn't do that because the string restarts here. So here I don't have to start up a new string, but I am going to get all this white space added in there. So then whenever I run the first one, I expect this string to be equal to that, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and it does. And then this one, I have a very fragile string because I have to get the exact right amount of white space that is put inside of that string. This gives you a brief rundown of how strings work inside of JavaScript. They have several methods and properties available. The number one gotcha here is with multi-line strings, and then also with concatenating strings and numbers, which is a common source of errors.